Welcome back, episode 20 of the Precious Metal Gents podcast. I'm Zan here with Brian, and today marks the very first of our PMG series, and we are going to look at 1997 and 98 for basketball anyway, the Reds and the Greens. So, as we talked about before, there are no Reds and Greens in baseball, but we're going to talk about them in basketball, kind of give an overview of the set, some of the grading and population reports. We're going to take you through a little bit about fake serials and look at our favorite cards from the football and basketball sets. And then we're going to have a conversation that you do not want to miss with Brendan Bigelow of PSA. He is the head of the authenticity department there. Goes by Roger Maris on Blowout Forums and 90s Wax on Instagram. And he is kind of the guru for all things 90s. So he's going to be joining us a little bit later in the show. But first up, we are going to skip the recurring segments and go ahead and get into the Precious Metal Gems presentation for 97. I would encourage everyone listening to stop the episode and go to YouTube and finish it out there because this is a heavily visual episode. Brian's got up here the first slide, which shows some reds and greens from basketball and football. We've got a red Deion Sanders, a red Shaq, green Shannon Sharp, and green Mutombo. Very, very colorful, a lot of pop to him. So, Brian, take us a little bit through kind of an overview of this set back to 97 when it was released.
So let's start with 97 football release, which if you remember from our previous PMG episode, there was a timeline. If not, go maybe take a look at that again. And we give you a nice list of what the release dates were. So the football release was the first metal release that had PMGs in it. And the reason that's significant is because a lot of people, I hear even to this day, and I read articles too that talk about the basketball set being, the very first PMGs and the flagship PMG parallel release, but it's just not true. On July 16th in 1997, the 97 Metal Universe football set was released. That was the first set that had the red and green PMGs in it. It even says on the box it's the premier edition. So they're trying to sell the PMGs based on the old baseball, and the football too, the precious metals cards. So they're just kind of taking them to the next level, changing the colors, and then serial numbering them. So pictured here, we got the box, which features the part of the Terrell Davis card, which was he was kind of the chase player at that time, getting very significant attention in the hobby and in football in general. He had a very short career, but one of probably the best four-year career, four-year prime in football history. So he was like at the peak of his hype right at this point. So he was featured on this set. The box was sold for about $49, nationwide, which is crazy to think about now. But again, this was a initial release of a product that was kind of meant to target kids. So it wasn't really trying to, be a high-end collector's chase. It was supposed to be something for kids to get their parents to spend money on. So it was released in a 200-card checklist, but there was 198 PMGs. That was because the two checklists didn't have the precious metal gems parallel. And then the cards were numbered initially in the football set out of 150. The first 15 cards are the greens, and the next 135 cards are the reds. So serial numbers 1 through 15 are your greens, and then anything 16 and above are going to be the reds. And again, it was the first PMG of any sport. That's probably why, I'm just speculating, that's probably why there's a serial numbering difference between this and the basketball set, which I'll show here in a second. I think, being that it was a bigger set, obviously, too, but they were kind of trying to find their price point, and they were trying to find their footing in this market. These cards were not cheap to produce. This foil etching and the refractor overlay on the cards was a very expensive process, and something that really hasn't been done or was never done in combination before this. So the precious metals, if you go back and take a look at those from the previous set, in football specifically, they just had kind of like a silver foil etching, but the design of the card wasn't really spectacular. And it didn't have any of the refractor overlay or UV overlay, whatever you want to call it or refer to it as. So if you do look at these in hand, if you've ever had one, they're not just like a flat foil card like the SP cards were back in the early 90s, or even those precious metals like I was referring to. There's like a refractor shine to them, so they are extremely shiny. You catch them in the light, so it's a combination of really two types of aesthetics on the card. What I have pictured here is the 97-98 Metal Universe basketball release, and that was released on November 5th, 1997. And all these dates and this information that I'm going over right now is all sourced on Beckett and a few other sources as well, but Beckett being the most prominent. So this is accurate data according to them. And the box that I have pictured here, one thing to point out is that it says Series 1. And I referred to that before when we had the previous episode introducing the PMGs, was that the basketball set said Series 1, and that often confuses the next release, which we'll talk about in a later episode, the 97-98 championship set. People at first thought that was like Series 2 because it was released in the same basketball season. It wasn't meant to be a second series. I don't know why this one said Series 1 on it. Maybe they intended originally to make a second series and they decided not to. I really don't know. I couldn't speculate. There's a lot of different opinions, but this set is a standalone set and it was essentially released, in one complete series. So there's 123 PMGs in this set in a 125 card set. So again, no checklist PMGs. The biggest difference between the football and the basketball is that this is a 100 card serial numbered parallel, where the first 10 are the greens and the next 90 are the reds. So a significantly less of a print run on these, which tends to lead to the higher prices, along with the fact that the basketball set was more well received. So I think really right out of the gates, these cards were priced significantly higher, especially the Jordan, higher than really any of the major players in the football set. So the box was about $20 cheaper, priced at about $30 a box, and that was due to the fact that there was 12 packs and one bonus pack. I don't even know why they say a bonus pack. There's 13 packs in the box. Selling tactic. 8 cards, just like the football release, but you're getting about like half the cards in the box, so hence the price was a little bit cheaper. So the biggest question that you hear a lot from modern collectors or people just getting into the 90s space or vintage collectors or really even people in the 90s that don't necessarily like the hype of the PMGs is, why is the PMG so popular? Like, why do you like it? Or why should a card that's numbered out of 135 or 90, depending on what sport you're looking at, why should they be priced significantly higher than other cards serial numbered the same, or like even a card that's, numbered out of 50 that goes for less, some other parallels? And I think that it's really all just personal preference. So this isn't any like, hard data that, we didn't do like some poll and ask the hobby what they think, but this is just a general consensus and some of the reasons why I think, and you can jump into, Zan, when I'm done going over this, what your opinion of this is, but it's a general consensus that it's the first year of the parallel, combined with the fact that, at least in the basketball set, it's like the Jordan's last dance season, and it was really propped up a lot and took a major boost this set of cards when the pandemic hit and the Lance Dance aired. Not that these weren't higher price, like we referenced a couple episodes ago that the basketball set was pretty significantly priced, and so was the football too in comparison. But it's not like they weren't semi-expensive cards when they first released. It's just that they've become like uber popular right now. And a lot of it has to do with it's the first of that parallel. And it's the last dance season. And then you got the design elements. that foil etching, the UV overlay, very expensive process. They're extremely condition sensitive. So if you think back to like vintage cards, the vintage card market is essentially base cards driven by condition sensitivity and scarcity of grade. Well, these kind of have that as well, not just the fact that they have an artificial scarcity, meaning that they're serial numbered, and they have a finite print run, but they compared to like vintage market, um, these are very scarce in terms of grade relatively. So like as you'll see in later slides, you don't have many gems. You don't have many cards that are even graded 8 or above. So the higher the grade, you get a significant price boost and value boost, and market multiplier just based on the condition. And then this design is one of a kind. So like the PMGs didn't replicate a design year in and year out like some other parallels. We've mentioned this before, but like you know, Skybox and Fleer, they were really good with creating a parallel and then keeping the parallel for a few years, but kind of changing the design of it and just trying new things. And they were really just back then. You had so much competition between brands, which was really good. You didn't have one brand owning a market, so you had these brands trying new things every year to try to be the new flashy object. And I think that bred creativity. It bred like design elements that we don't really see anymore because these companies were just trying different things. And then it's, as I mentioned before, it's the growth of the artificial scarcity and serial numbering in 96 and 97. So it was in a period of time where base cards were still like, if you look at an old Beckett magazine from 96 or 97, if you look at like the hot list, so they printed a hot list at the article section of the Beckett guides. And in that hot list, it lists like 10 cards that were, the most popular of that month, right? And most of those cards were, if not all of them, were base cards. And anytime a insert or a parallel would make that hot list, it was like, craziness. There would always be, some snide remarks in the article, like, why is this card there? Yeah, we get it. It looks like this or it's serial number, but like it shouldn't be here. People at that time, the editors and the dealers, and even the I guess the dinosaurs of the hobby at that time they were really still stuck on the base card. An 89 score Barry Sanders was, in their eyes, was seen to be more of a significant card than like maybe even his green or red PMG, which is craziness to think now, but it was just a different time. So you see this scarcity come into play in a period of time when there really wasn't much, a lot of base cards still. So they're significant looking back at them now. So they were just pretty much released at a perfect time, and they were kind of, pioneers in that era.
And to kind of tack on to that about the base cards running their course, we had seen in 96, 97 the first numbered parallel in basketball with Flair Showcase. And then you had the EX 2000 credentials. The Flair Showcase was out of 150, credentials out of 499. Both of those parallels looked, remarkably similar to the base cards. For the Flair Showcase, it was just a small change, right? But the numbering and the foil coloring versus the base cards. And we've talked about that with Flair Showcase before. It's not a huge distinction between the base and the legacy. And then the credentials, obviously you had more of a refractor finish on the border of every card, but 499 copies wasn't really exclusive. And then you hit 97, 98, this comes out. You've got people have, enjoyed metal. Clearly, there's fans of comic books from before it was sports affiliated, and now you've got trial runs in baseball, and basketball, and football. And so you've got a fan base, and they release this product that just has just 100 copies of all parallels combined, which is two parallels. But you get the greens and the reds, and so they're so visually distinct from the base cards. And even the other parallels that came out that year, like the grand finale and SPX, it's not that distinct. It's somewhat distinct because it's a gold hologram versus a silver one, but this changes the whole design scheme. And I think that's part of why it was an immediate hit. And also, like you mentioned, it was really fueled by that Jordan card. All right. So let's talk a little bit about serial numbers before we get into looking at some of the distinctions between real and fake. Well, just general overview here. For basketball PMGs, across all companies, there's 2,559 cards graded. 1,687 are by PSA. So you can see there the majority of the cards graded are by PSA. And that's of the, if you multiply the set times the amount of parallels, you've got 12,300 total PMG print run. So 12,300 total reds and greens amongst all players, which means about 20% of the set, or 20% of all cards have been graded. Now, obviously, there are some crossovers, so that number may skew a little bit lower than 20.7% if you have people cracking them or just crossing them to other grading companies. One thing is for sure, between both basketball and football, it's very difficult, nearly impossible to get a PSA 10 or BGS 9.5 on these cards because they are so prone to chipping. That foil that Brian mentioned is very condition sensitive. And so you get a lot of just a little wear and tear on the edges and the corners, and it rubs off pretty easily. So in basketball, you only have 4 total gem copies. There's a Duncan red PSA 10, which is his rookie card, 2 BGS 9.5 Jordan reds, and then there's the best player of the bunch, a Walt Williams BGS 9.5 red that you can maybe get your hands on. Jordan red is the most graded overall. There's 69 of them that have been graded. So that's the red, and that's so 69 out of 90. That's a lot, obviously. Again, crossovers, etc. But most of the Jordans are out there in circulation. The McGrady green is interesting because it's pop 10, which suggests that probably not all 10 copies have been pulled and graded. Likely some of them were cracked and resubmitted or crossed over, but still, probably more than 5 copies have, with different serial numbers, have been graded. So that's the most populous green PMG in basketball. In football, we just looked at PSA. Beckett, as we've talked about, there's just too many issues with slabbing cards that are missing serial numbers, slabbing cards that have fake serial numbers. So we looked at just PSA. Because there's more cards in the football set, 29,700 is the total PMG print run. And so about 6% of all those cards have been graded by PSA, so a little just below 1,900. Only one gem copy, which is an Orlando Pace, also a rookie card, red, PSA 10. So again, extremely difficult to get a gem there. The Merino red, like the Jordan, is the most graded overall, but unlike the Pop 69 Jordan, you've only got 19 Merino reds graded out of 135 copies. And then Favre and Emmett greens each have 5 copies graded, which again is pretty high. That's a third of the print run. But some of those may be crossovers, cracks, or God forbid, fakes.
So looking at the serial number thing before we go on to the next part, what do you think if you had to just guess? Like, what do you think the number of total copies of like basketball, like just go percentages, basketball and football PMGs are actually out in the market combined with like the graded copies and the raw? I just don't believe. I know there's some people that say, well, there's obviously 100% of the print run is out there because they printed it and put it out. I just don't believe I don't believe that it's out there. I think some of this stuff got destroyed. I don't want to be like a conspiracy theorist, but I just don't see. I don't see it how it's possible that even 75% of these cards survived.
Yeah, I mean it's very difficult to very difficult to put a number on it because still people always forget about, like, they just assume because it's an old product, they're all out there, but there's a lot of unopened boxes. And now, especially basketball, you can't, unless you're like Nat Turner, you can't afford to rip a box of this. It's just not feasible. I don't even know the cost, but they're probably like I don't know how many thousands of dollars a box of 97, 98 metal is for basketball. It's expensive for football too. And so there's still some in boxes. And like you said, it's very possible that a lot of these got thrown out, maybe by the company, maybe by collectors over the years. So the out of 150 or the out of 100 in modern terms is probably more like an out of 75 or out of 50 type of card.
Yeah, and even with like the Jordan Red 69 graded, I'd say probably a third of those are cracked out and reslab, just because of the
Yeah,
significant multiplier for a PSA copy in a red, especially. They sell it for higher than the BGS, so people were cracking them out and regrading them with PSA just because. I mean, honestly, the thing looks awesome, and the red Jordan looks awesome in a PSA slab. So people were just taking the grade boost or dump.
that's right. Let's look at the serial numbers. So, one of the things we've noticed over the past couple of years is an unusually high number of football PMGs, reds and greens, that have been released for auction or just come up on public marketplace fixed price listings that seem to have serial numbers that are not visually similar to pack pulled copies. And so what this has done has led to marketplace confusion and a lack of knowledge, a lack of assuredness for buyers that they can purchase this card and have it be real. Now it happens in basketball. I don't look at it that often in basketball. It happens a lot less for whatever reason. There's more sheets, more uncut sheets of football because again there were 45 more red copies, 5 more green copies. So you just had more sheets that were released during the bankruptcy. And there were cards that came out prior to bankruptcy that were stamped. One of the things that it's important, I think, for everybody to be able to do when you're looking for a 97 PMG is to delineate between the fake and the real. And so we felt the easiest way to do that would be to put side by side 2 cards here, the same player with the same serial number, but very different. One's real, one's not. So I'll pause briefly if you're listening to this. Take a look. Which one do you think is the real one? If you said it's the one on the left, you're correct. The one on the left is consistent with every other pack pulled 97 PMG. The thing you want to look for, well, there's a few things, but every card has a 0 or a 1 in it, no matter whether it's 001 or copy 150. Every card has a 0, a 1, or both. And if you can spot the differences between the 0 and the 1, you're doing well. So the 0 here on the left, if you're just looking at them, you can move around these pictures, stack them. But what you'll see is the 0 on the left is narrower. The one on the right has a little bit of an elongated horizontal top and bottom. And so when I'm looking at greens, that's just the first thing I look at is the 0, and that's the giveaway. I don't even have to look at the rest of the numbers. The 0 tells me automatically whether it's real or whether it's not. Also, the 1 here. The one on the left you can see is a little bit darker, but the best way to describe this is if you look at the little hook at the top of the one, what we call the serif. On the real copy, it's almost tighter to the I guess the vertical line of the one, and points almost in a southwest direction. Versus the one on the right, the serif almost points in a west direction. And we're really getting into the weeds here, but again, this is important to know if you're looking at these cards. You can kind of see that the ones are visually distinct. The fives are as well. If you got a 7, that might be the easiest number to discern the difference. A 7, if it has a little hook coming down from the top, that's a real 7. If it doesn't, it's a fake. One of the other things that you want to pay attention to is what's called the kerning, Kerning, or the spacing between the numbers. You'll see with the real ones, the spacing between the digits is consistent. And on the right here, the gap between the 0 and the 1 is larger than the gap between the 1 and the 5. It's pretty clear. You can see that. And on every pack pulled copy, you also have this spacing to the left of the slash. So the third digit in the serial number, the 5 in this case, and the slash on the real one has a gap of maybe 1/4 of an inch or something like that. Versus on the right, there's almost no gap at all. And you can just see that in any pack pull copy, you can be rest assured that it's going to sit off a little bit, about 1/4 inch to the left of the slash. So you've got all these visual cues. You've got the font of the numbers, the spacing between the numbers, spacing after the final digit, that kind of clue you in to what's pack pulled and what's not. And we're going to talk with Brendan a little bit later about how PSA goes about this. And there was actually a period of time where, well, I doubt it happens as much anymore because Brendan's there, but you have some cards that are fakes that ended up in PSA slabs. And for a little bit of time last year, I was helping their, I can't remember what the department name is, but there was a number of them on eBay. So I would send them the listings. They would immediately get the listing taken down, and they would have the the certification number decertified in their database, like within a day. And this happened maybe 6 to 8 times on various platforms where I would send it to them. They would see it, pull it down, and decertify it almost immediately. So they're very good about that. Beckett, not so much. But just the lesson if you see a card in a PSA slab, don't automatically assume that it's good. If it has a more recent serial number, more recent certification number, you're probably fine. But I think it can never hurt to kind of learn how to check these yourself. And if there are specific things that you want to know or want to ask, feel free to message me and I'll try to take you through that. But I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview about kind of what to look for when we're talking about serial numbers. Before we move on to our conversation with Brendan, we wanted to talk a little bit about our favorites, our favorite designs. And so we had a few guidelines that we were looking at, that we were looking at the card only in its PMG format, so red or green, not the creative background on the base card, because that would elevate some of these cards above others. But like we've talked about before, the red and green can obscure certain details in the base cards. Just looking at the parallels. Second, player significance to the set or the era. Most of these players are going to be Pro Bowlers, Hall of Famers, All Pros, etc. And then third, kind of in the back of your mind, is value. Not as big for me, not as big for us. But we really wanted to go with cards that had a visual appeal to us. So I'm going to start with my number 5, and then we're going to alternate all the way down to 1. My number 5, Jerry Rice Red. Pretty hard to beat this card. The 49ers team color match is really strong in the set, maybe the best color match in the set. So the Rice Red is a beautiful card. He's like in the middle of receiving a pass. This card seems to be a hard one to find in good condition. You get this copy here on the screen. You can see a little bit of the foil by the football and under gems that's been removed, that white there. But I love this card. I don't think I'll be able to afford a copy of it, but this is definitely one that catches my attention every time I see it.
Yeah, I could have easily put this one in my top five, but I didn't. It's just there. It's really tough to narrow this down to five, especially in the football set. But I try my best, and I try to have reasons for each one. But this is an awesome card. It's an honorable mention for me. Could easily be on the list. My number five was the berry green. The reason why I chose the berry green over the red is just because I think the green and the blue match really well. The silver on his pants, the white jersey. One thing I look for with the red and the green PMGs when you're looking at like aesthetics is that it either has to be it has to be a color match for me to really like the design of that particular card, or it has to be like a stark contrast. So like with this Barry, he's got the white jersey on. I don't know if he had the blue jersey on, if I would like it as much. I probably would. It would probably still be my favorite in the green, but having the white with the green, it really looks cool. Plus the photo, I don't think enough can be said. Zay mentioned before with the Barry or the Jerry Rice, he's like mid catching a pass. You can see the ball spiraling to his hands. This one, Barry's got like a look of evil on his face, like he's gonna either juke
I
somebody out
agree.
or truck over a few guys. But you don't have these cards unless you have great photography. If you have shit photography on here and you just put a foil etched background, it's not going to be as cool. So the photography in each of these cards kind of helps to make the set.
Yeah, it's a strong card. I had to go with the green for my number four. I went with Junior Seau. This one is, I love the old Chargers uniforms. He's like the only good player on that team. And he has something of like a backpack here. There's a few guys in the set that have like a jetpack on. Emmett Smith maybe being the most notable. But again, I like this action shot mid run. It's about to just stuff some ball carrier for like a 1 yard loss coming up the middle. So I had to go with the green too, and Sayal's one of my favorite defensive players from that time.
Yeah, it's a really cool card. I think this could easily be my favorite of the set. I just think there's some more significant cards that I kind of have to put above it. But one aesthetic I really like about the reds and greens in football and basketball is that when the since the background design can't really be seen as well on the PMGs, when there's kind of a intersection between the green or red foil and the player photo, that makes it look better to me because it kind of like if the player is just on top of this green or red background, it kind of looks like it's not part of the card. It doesn't look as cool. When you kind of intermingle the foil with the player for this one, for example, it kind of the foil smoke or whatever this is overlaps or goes in front of Brunel on this card, and it just kind of brings the player into the card. Same thing with like the jetpack on the last one with Junior Seau and some of the other players. It makes the player a part of the card. So this one is my number four. It's the Mark Brunell Green, card number 64. I don't know if there's a better jersey color match other than maybe the Niners with the Reds than the teal Jaguars and the green. It's not even really like a color match, but for some reason that neon green looks really good with the teal on the Jaguars jersey. And it's a great image of Brunell. It's like smoke or something over. I can't remember what the base card is, but it's like smoke going over the front of him. It's just a really awesome looking card. It's one of my favorites. Any Jaguars in this set are really cool.
Yeah, that's nice. PK, if you're watching, put the Kleenex and Jergens away. We're gonna move on to the next slide here. All right, number four. Oh, wait, number four. Number three for me. I went with a card. This is a homer pick, not because I'm a Bills fan, because I own the card. Bruce Smith. I really love. I think there's. I think you could call this a color match. You know, the red is bright enough, vivid enough that it kind of matches that really deep orange, Auburn orange of the Bills, especially here on this card. I got this at the National. It's right here. I'm holding it up if you're watching. Um, Bruce has something of I guess it's like a turbine behind him or something like that. I don't really know, but it's it's propelling him into an offensive lineman. Um, I really like this color match. The Hall of Fame defensive players in the set just have my attention right now. And then on the back, he's got the logo athletic hat. So I had to give it an extra nod. I mean, they just don't make them like that anymore.
Yeah, the old Bills uniform, they were one of the few that had champion at the time.
Oh
And
yeah,
it was really just a cool, that was like the peak of the NFL and they all had different jersey,
I
like
know.
brands. It's so awesome. All right. And then, yeah, the Favre green PMG, not much of a surprise. It had to be somewhere in the top three for me. It's like, I mean, if you gave me one choice of a card from the set, I would take the Favre green. But if we're just looking at primarily design, it's not my ultimate favorite. It's top three, but it's not my number one. The background of this one, he's got a bear coming at him. So I think the base card looks really, really cool. You can't really see that in any of the PMGs, but again, it's got that like it's snow coming down, and in this case, it's green snow. It's like a semi-color match. She's got the Packers green, and then it's a neon green. It's just I think it's a really cool card. I kind of like the fact that he's not perfectly centered. I know some people said like, well, you can't see the background and he's not really centered. It looks kind of weird, but to me, it kind of looks cool because the precious metal gems font on the top left, and then having him, it's something about the card I just always liked it. The green and the yellow on his pants. It's a great image of him. It's just iconic. So I mean, I have the red. I'm never most likely never going to get the green. So the red's the best I'm going to get with it. It still looks really cool because it's a nice contrast. But definitely, if I had a choice, the Favre green would be it.
Yeah, I like this, like the spacing here. Like I don't know if he was a photography person, but like the rule of thirds, it draws your eye away from the center. It helps kind of balance him with all this negative space on the left. He's got like you said, the precious metal gems, and his name is almost offset. I really like it. Like you said, it kind of hides some of the detail, but it is one of the best looking cards to me in the set. My number two, I went with a Packers card, but because Brian had the Favre on there, I went with the Reggie White green. This image isn't particularly clear. The Reggie White, there's only two copies graded. One is a BGS 8.5, one is a BGS 6. The BGS 8.5 is not real. It's got a fake serial. This might be the only one. This one, he's got like rubble collapsing around him. He's like Smith. He's in the middle of, I don't know if it's pass rush or run stop, but it's an action shot again. And so with just, I know it's a slightly off, but it's like the neon green is sort of between the darker green and the yellow for the Packers. It's almost like a gradient. Goes from the yellow to the neon green to the dark green. I just think in terms of compliment, I like this a little bit more than the Jaguars, but I could see why you like that one.
This design might be the best where it like incorporates the background image in the photo of the player, if
Right.
that makes sense, especially with the green. I mean, he's got like when you talk about rubble, he's like borderline covered with the stuff on the
Yeah.
card. And then I mean
Yeah.
it's really a cool card for sure.
What's your number two?
My number two is a card that I used to have. I sold it to Andy. I think it might have been last year or the year before. I had the PSA 7 version of this, but it's the Young Red. Could easily be number one for me. It his white jersey with the red, obviously in the Niners, the red numbers and then the red background, and it's got that same. Usually, I didn't mean to put the same design. Some of these cards have the same design. Like two or three of the cards in the set will have like the same background. This one's got the same like smoke effect or whatever it is as the Brunel, but the cards look a lot different. So he's got the Brunel is kind of more of a close up. This one's a little bit further back, but I just love this card. It's got just enough of the interaction between the background and the player. The red on the white jersey, it pops. And I mean, it's an action shot of Young. Again, these are like all action shots in this set, and they're just perfectly framed in the card, which I think adds to it a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to beat. the Niners color match, which is why my number one is the TO, number 22 in the set. I had the Rice 5. I know that's more valuable, but Owens, I like. He's one of my favorite receivers from the time period. So this one, very similar to Brunel and Young. The base version has this, I say nonsensical, but it's hard to really describe what the design is. It looks like almost like a web or some kind of like, I don't know, plasma flowing along the card. And you can see it here, the outline of it. But this is just, it just reminds me, I know it's not the same here, but I just, every time I see it, I think about his, like being a kid and seeing I think it was his 20 catch game, maybe a 98, 99 when he had that. I think it was against the Bears. But it's just one of those kind of core memories that sticks out in my head and watching that on him do that on NFL prime time. And so this card I really like. I only have one red PMG, but this one's definitely on my list.
My number one was basically what I considered probably the chase card of the set. He's on the box. I don't know why I like this design so much. It's kind of odd. He's like carrying. It's a Terrell Davis green, number 23. He's carrying like a, I don't know. I was referred to it like a fire hose or something, with a backpack. But the backpack is around his shoulders. He's got a hose in his hand, a football in the other hand. I think. I mean, I love Terrell Davis. If I were to collect a player, a non-Packers player, it would be Terrell Davis. I love him as a player, always have, even when he was destroying the Packers. I love this set as a kid, and with him on the box in this Orange Crush uniform with the blue helmet, which the Broncos brought back last weekend, and they're going to not wear it again. I don't understand why they don't just keep this uniform. It makes no sense, but it really pops on this green. Something with like the orange and that blue, that sky blue with this green background. It's just, it does a ton. If you look at this card, if you like 90s football and you like, the Terrell Davis era, the late 90s, you look at this card and you don't like feel something, there's something wrong with you, because it's an awesome card. It's on the box. It's probably the best card, I think, in the set at the time. Obviously now there's more expensive, more valuable ones, but this was like the peak of his, hype. He was going into his best season, and he was just everything in the NFL at the time.
Yeah, that's a great looking card. I know that means is a big one for you nostalgically. That jersey is really cool. All right, for the sake of time, we're going to look at just a top five sort of joint list for basketball. Same criteria, but we want to have Brendan on. So Brian, just take us through the top five that we settled on for basketball.
So one that I really liked was I liked the player obviously a lot. He was one of my favorite players in the '90s, but Larry Johnson. I didn't like him as much when he was on the Knicks. I wish he would have still been on the Hornets. If he had a Hornets card in this set, the pinstripes with a green background would have just been insane. But unfortunately, he's in a Knicks uniform here. No offense to Knicks fans, but it's still an awesome card. It's a number 5 for me. He's it's the Larry Johnson red, number 88. He's going up for a dunk, and he's just got that grandmama look on his face, and it's the red. It's like flames or something behind him and the ball. It's a really cool looking card. It matches that orangish on the blue jersey, the orange and blue jerseys. It's a really neat card, I think.
I like it. The only improvement that could have been made would be him in a Hornets
Oh
uniform.
yeah, for sure. Another one kind of goes under the radar a little bit. It's kind of on that same sense of the rubble falling down like the Reggie White previously, but it's the Sharif Abdur-Rahim green, number 31. And this card's cool because it's got the blue Grizzlies uniform. If you remember the Grizzlies uniform from the 90s, the Bryant Reeves jerseys, and it's a really cool uniform. It plays really well with the green background, and this one's got like rubble or something falling in front of them. Again, it's that combination of the player photo with the background kind of being the player kind of falling into the background. And when you got these PMGs, you can't see the background, so you need to have that interaction between the background foil and the player, and this one really definitely has it. going up for a dunk or a layup, another action shot. Basketball did a really good job too with the action shots. With football, it's kind of a lot of football cards you're going to have action because a lot of the photography is when they're mid play. With basketball, I mean, you could easily get a guy where they're just kind of standing around waiting for the ball, or not doing anything. And some cards that you even see today, they do it. These all the basketball players in this set, they're all like mid shot, dunking, rebounding, stealing, doing something, doing a layup. They're moving, and it's just, and they focus on the player, generally like the upper half, and it really looks good.
Yeah, that's a good man. He was so underrated. Just kind of wasted away in Vancouver for a few years there. But that's a great looking card. I'm glad we had a guy on the list that wasn't a household name. But speaking of household names, what do you have at number three?
Yeah, it's the Kobe 3. The Kobe's at number 3. I picked the red. I mean, obviously the green would be is awesome, but I think the red actually looks better with the yellow. Something about it. I think the reason why I've always liked this card a lot was it's not even so much the background. There's no real interaction between the background and the player, and honestly, like the base card looks a lot better when it comes to like seeing the background with this. But it's his photo. I think this is one of the best, if not the best, photos in the entire basketball set. He's dishing it. It's it's just an awesome look on him. It's a mid-action shot, the ball moving. He's got the classic yellow Lakers jersey. It's just a really cool shot. I think early Kobe card, second year.
Yeah, that's maybe his most recognizable or iconic photograph on any card.
Definitely, yeah. This one could easily be number one. I think the fact that I'm not, when you hear this and you know which one's left, you're going to know what my number one is. But this Ray Allen, the green specifically, if I were to collect a basketball player, and I kind of dipped my toes into it a little bit, but it was pulling money away from collecting the Brewers stuff and the significant Favre cards and Rogers cards, so I had to kind of cut it. But I can't collect everything. But if I could get a basketball card, this would be it. The Ray Allen green. If you don't know what it looks like, go look it up. Just the base card in general, but like the green specifically, because the Bucks are wearing the green uniforms. Um, Ones that they usually don't wear. It was like an alternate uniform back in the '90s where they had a big. It's all green. They had the typical Bucks logo on their shorts, and then the number or the letters and the numbers were like a faded, like a silver and purple, and then they had a big Bucks emblem on the side. I guess would be the right side of their jerseys that would kind of wrap around to the front. Kind of an alternate back then. They didn't wear it very often, but with that like it's like a forest green, and then with the bright neon green background, and then this image where there's like it's like meteors or something, and the ball looks like it's on fire. It looks like it's something straight out of NBA Jam. It's just an insane looking card. If you gave me one choice to like, aside from value, obviously, you gave me one choice of a card from this set, it would be this card. The only reason why it's not number one is because of like the rules that we kind of put in place with this, where the significance of a player, this has the number one design in my opinion, but then you kind of look at the significance of a player with the design it being real close is why it can't be number one.
Yeah, that's a beautiful card. I might pick that one too if I had one choice.
And then number one, obviously being the Jordan red, not the green. I think the red looks better because he's got the white uniform, the red numbers. Super iconic card. I think it's Jordan's best looking card of any of them. I'm not a Jordan collector, so if someone's a Jordan collector and they say it's not, I would probably defer to them. But being an outsider looking in, I think this is his most. You talked about the Kobe being recognizable. To me, this is like Jordan's most recognizable card. Probably because of the Last Dance and the pandemic, and it's the Last Dance season, and I know he's got another. He's got the PMG championship, which is part of the same season, and it's iconic too. But this thing is just insane. The fire on the basketball, it's part of the background. It's just dunking. It's got everything to me.
Yeah, I guess some people might call it the perfect card, and uh, there have been a lot of fakes of this card, a lot of ground up fakes, and there are certain key things to look for. Um, I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any thoughts about the 97 reds and greens, please message us. We can always talk about it more on another show. But we thought that was a really good introduction to the series. Now we are going to turn to the main course. Brendan Bigelow from PSA Collectors coming on the show to talk a little bit about PMGs, PSA's authenticity, our authentication process, and even his collection. So, hope you guys enjoy this and get some really valuable information out of it. All right, we are here with Brendan Bigelow. He goes by 90s Wax on Instagram, Roger Maris on Blowout. Brendan, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We've wanted to have you on for, basically since we started this in the summer. We thought at some point we would want to have you on. We felt like this was a good time to do it when we're kind of been doing these miniature episodes on PMGs. But you're a collector. You work for PSA. Brendan's part of the brand protection team. We're going to get into that a little bit. But first thing we do with all guests is we want to start off hearing about, how you started collecting when you were a kid and sort of your journey from, through teens and into adulthood and where you are now.
Yeah, so I've been collecting pretty much as long as I can remember. My dad was a big collector. When he was a teenager, he would make money by buying vending boxes of 1975 tops, completing the sets and selling them through like ads in the newspaper. So growing up, our house was always full of vintage cards. He had complete set runs from 1952 to 1977 or 78. He had, full complete sets. And so growing up, there were just always cards in the household. And I always remembered my dad telling me about certain cards. Going with my dad to the bank, so I could, if he like needed a birth certificate or something out of the safe deposit box, I would come with him so I could see all the cards in there because he kept like the 52 mantle and the big cards locked away. Um, and so yeah, it was definitely something I associate like with my dad, and of course I grew up pretty at a very prime time, as it turned out in hindsight, for collecting. I was born in '88, and so my first collecting memories that I have are like 1994, 1995. But particularly like 1996, Kobe's rookie year. I grew up in Los Angeles, so I was a big Laker fan. So Kobe's rookie year just sort of amplified my desire to collect. And I think also too, like the cards of the late '90s really captured my imagination and my interest. And I liked, the idea of serial numbered cards and the rarity and the interesting designs. And the only period where I wasn't, and of course too, I collected Pokemon cards as a kid, as we all did. So that again just kind of reinforced this love of pieces of cardboard. Um, and I had a little bit of a lull in my collecting, when I went off to college, kind of that like late high school, early college years. But I think after my freshman year, it kind of kicked back in. I had my first kind of job. I was getting my first paychecks. And of course, the first thing, I wanted to spend any kind of disposable income on were all the cards that I'd wanted as a kid that I couldn't afford, which at that time, oddly enough, was mostly vintage cards. When I first got back into the hobby as a quote unquote adult, I wanted to buy all the cards that I remember my dad talking about, the 33 Gaudis. The first set I ever tried to put together was 33 Worldwide Gum, which is like the Canadian Gaudi. Bit smaller of a set, but I was really into like 1914 Cracker Jacks for a long time. And I really didn't start, and Pokemon as well in college. I started buying like old first edition sets in anticipation that they would become unaffordable at some point. I knew our generation would get nostalgic about cards and that the prices would eventually go up. So I spent that time trying to buy kind of key pieces that I knew I wanted to own. Um, And I really didn't get into the 90s stuff until, my mid to late 20s, I think, when I really started getting nostalgic about that era. Obviously, I love the vintage cards, but I didn't have a sentimental connection to them the way I did to the 90s stuff. And so, yeah, around late 20s, I shifted from vintage and went kind of full steam into 90s.
So you ended up at PSA or Collectors at some point. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and then how that intersects with your collecting as of right now?
Yeah, so I was obviously, well, like I said, I was a big 90s collector, and I was extremely obsessive about it. I was on the forums, refreshing threads. I was on eBay, refreshing eBay listings throughout the day, trying to find deals, trying to find cards I needed. And it was through that process that I developed a sense. I started noticing patterns and things like that, and I ended up discovering, that certain sets and certain cards were being counterfeited. And I began posting about it on the Blowout forums, which, back in the day was kind of the central hub, the town square of the hobby. That and Net54 for vintage, posted a lot there too back in the day. But yeah, once I started discovering fakes, I started posting about them. And at first, when I first started posting, I would describe how to spot fakes, and, what I would give away basically all the telltale signs and all that, trying to educate people so they wouldn't get ripped off. And then I discovered that forgers were, also paying attention to it, and they were actually improving their forgeries based on, um, the tells that I was calling out on these public forums. And so I decided to stop going into detail about how to tell when cards were fake. But of course, that requires people to put their faith in you and basically have kind of blind trust in your opinions and your judgment. So initially, I faced like quite a bit of pushback from the community when I would post about this stuff, especially people who had, were heavily invested in the 90s. They were, I think, the most reluctant to accept any opinion I had. Particularly, of course, people too, when you're telling them their card is fake. No one likes to hear that. So it took a little while, but eventually, people did. The community started to accept me, and this work I was doing on the counterfeiting side. And a lot of the cards I was calling out were graded, obviously, by BGS, SGC, PSA, and I as I was posting about these cards, PSA actually reached out to me. This would have been maybe like 2019 or so, pre-COVID, and wanted me to talk to one of their graders and, kind of help them out. And at that time, I had no problem divulging all the information to a grading company. I just didn't want it out in the public where, other counterfeiters could use it to improve their fakes. So I started sharing information with PSA, and even after I started sharing information, I was noticing, cards were still slipping through, and eventually, Steve Sloan, the president of PSA at the time, called me and just said, "Hey, like, could we work with you more formally to help us out with, this issue, the counterfeiting issue, particularly with 90s cards?" And I said, "Sure." So I started out kind of like as a consultant, basically. And then in 2021, after Nat bought the company, and Nat and I had a relationship before that because, he's a big 90s guy, and I was authenticating a lot of his cards, selling him a lot of cards. And he reached out to me and, said, "Hey, I want you to come work here full time. What's it going to take?" And we worked it out. And so, yeah, now I'm actually in Santa Ana right now at the office this week. And I've been working full time for the last 3 years.
Wow. So you mentioned this earlier, and we talked about this earlier. You go by Roger Maris on Blowout, and you were saying that you kind of got into just by patrolling the internet, essentially looking for it. Were there things that you saw, common themes that were coming up, and with fakes, and like were there things that tipped you off? I mean, without getting into specifics, or how did the process go of kind of learning about what was fake and what was not?
Yeah, so the process I used back then is the same process I use today, which is it's these fakes that we're talking about are very sophisticated, a lot of them, and they're very hard to detect the differences. There are times where it's taken me several weeks before I feel confident, of nonstop studying and just staring at cards before I feel confident that something is fake. You you really have to have a hunch that something is fake before you look into it. You can't, with these really high end counterfeits that are coming out of Asia, you if you just look at them in a vacuum, you're never going to have any suspicion that there's anything wrong with the card. In fact, to this day, a lot of these cards, if you just showed me the front, I would not be able to tell you if it's real or fake. I need, I have specific tells that I need to look for, and absent being able to see those, the cards are functionally identical. So for me, the first thing is always like contextual, and like I said, I was on eBay all the time refreshing, and I started noticing cards that I'd been looking for, in some cases for like 20 years and never seen before, are suddenly surfacing in large quantities. Or, sets that were really rare, but then one or two players would be selling every week, whereas, the other players hadn't surfaced in 10 years. So not only did I notice that the market, the way these cards were coming to market was suspicious, in addition to that, they were also coming from the same sellers, and they were also coming from the same parts of the world. So a lot of these cards that were suddenly, formerly very rare and suddenly very ubiquitous, not only were they being sold by the same handful of sellers, but all of those sellers would either be from China or Taiwan. And so at that point, I had a very strong suspicion, that something was going on. And then it was a matter of taking the time and kind of training my eye. And, it's almost like one of those old I Spy, games where you have, spot the difference. And you just, pour over images and figure out what is natural variance and what is not, and then you end up, finding some indicators and you use those. And that's basically the technique, for anything that's counterfeit.
What, real quick, what if there was a young person working in the brand protection team now, they come to Brendan to ask questions about what might be fake and what's not. As you were learning, did you have somebody that you could kind of lean on that had ever looked into this, or was this
No,
pretty novel?
it was like there was no trail blazed really that I could follow or other experts in the field. You have to remember too, when I was doing this, 90s cards were worth a lot less, and a lot of people did not think they were even worth counterfeiting, especially as sophisticated as they were. Like, people look at these counterfeits and, you can tell a lot of time and effort was put into creating them. So a lot of people didn't think it was possible for counterfeits that were that accurate to even exist. Now you have to remember too, like back then when people talked about counterfeit cards, people were talking about vintage cards. And in a lot of ways, vintage counterfeits are not nearly as sophisticated as, counterfeits from the 90s and later, partly due to the fact that card companies in the 90s started using commercially available materials rather than making things themselves. So, like, a lot of the foil patterns, like the scope, there's a reason why Panini has the same scope pattern that Fleer was using for their PMG championship cards. It's because Fleer didn't develop that pattern or that sheet. It's commercially available right now. You can go on Amazon and buy, the superfractor foil that Topps uses for their superfractors. That's commercially available. You can go out and buy that and make your own superfractor. And if you look at it under magnification, that gold vinyl pattern will look the same on your card as it will on one of Topps cards. And it wasn't just the materials either, like the cardstock and all that, the photography as well. Back in the day, Topps used to have its own photographers that would send out, and Topps would own the negatives. And so if you wanted to reproduce the images on the card, you had to scan them and reproduce them that way. Nowadays, and again, starting in the 90s, card companies were using stock photography. You can go on Getty Images right now and find, all of Kobe's rookie year card images, publicly commercially available in high resolution. So it required kind of a new approach to detecting counterfeits that people hadn't really developed or used before because these kind of counterfeits hadn't existed up until this point.
So one thing as a collector, one thing that I love about PSA is their authentication process and their guarantee, and I think they're above and beyond any other company, obviously. And that's the main thing that I value as a collector, and as does many, probably including yourself as a collector as well. So which is why you got into this. But without giving away any trade secrets or anything, can you get into a little bit of the authentication process, specifically when it comes to the PMGs and how that works with PSA? Anything that you can kind of divulge to us a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I can't go into too much detail, but I can tell you, like you said, we have a buyback guarantee. So unlike every other company, no company wants to grade a fake card, but for PSA, we have a much higher incentive not to grade fake cards because potentially, if we grade a fake, we have to buy it back, and so it can actually cost the company, money. And because of that, I think we've probably developed the most robust kind of system of checks and balances, and a lot of recently a lot of technological advancements to not only make sure that these cards are reviewed by the proper people, but also that we're detecting new fakes as they come to market. It's a constant race and battle. I don't know if you remember. I always think about that scene in Alice in Wonderland, where they're on the chessboard and Alice and the Queen are running and they're not getting anywhere. And Alice is like, "Well, why don't we just stop?" And they're like, "Well, if we stop, we're going to move backwards." And that's how it feels. It's like, in order to just stay in the same place and have the same coverage of these counterfeits, we need to constantly be innovating and adapting, and basically keeping eyes on the hobby to detect these fakes as they come to market, just in order to keep up with the counterfeiters. It's a constant battle, um, and the counterfeiters are getting more and more sophisticated all the time. So I wish I could go into more detail, but to put it succinctly, yeah, we have a lot of experts. We have the best subject matter experts in the hobby working for us, and we make sure that any card that comes in that falls into their expertise is viewed by them. And then we also have some new exciting kind of technological developments we're working on to detect existing fakes as well as new ones.
So a little branch off of that, quickly. The vintage era, you had a lot of card trimming and you had a lot of fakes, and then it seems like the '90s era is defined by these, the backdoor copies and the stamps, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit more. But then, what are you seeing? Is there this, the same amount of fakes and counterfeits that you're seeing with the ultra modern stuff too? Is it just like a new type of counterfeiting, or can you talk a little bit about that at all?
Yeah, so there was a period where there was a period where '90s cards were considered safe, and then they started being counterfeited in the mid 2000s, and backdoored earlier than that. But um, there was, up until recently, kind of a general sense that, okay, '90s and earlier is a minefield, but as long as I'm collecting Panini cards or recent Topps issues, I'm okay. That's not really the case anymore. I think after COVID and after the boom and after the hobby kind of went mainstream again, it really, as much as it brought hobbyists kind of back to the hobby and collectors back to the hobby, it also brought counterfeiters and forgers back to the hobby. And we've seen a big uptick lately in counterfeit cards from really modern sets and very sophisticated counterfeits, like at the same level of sophistication as the '90s counterfeits. They're extremely, and they're very hard to detect. And they're also, I think there was also a belief up until recently that counterfeits were mostly reserved for high end cards. But there's that old saying that it's easier to counterfeit a 20 than 100 or 5 than 100. And the same is true for cards. And so we're seeing some of these very sophisticated counterfeiters, which, hitherto we're focusing on the really high end stuff, focusing on lower value cards, even cards only worth a few dollars, creating really sophisticated counterfeits of them. So all that's out the window. And yeah, at this point, nothing is really considered safe. You have to be vigilant about everything, even sets that just came out last year.
So obviously, this episode is about we. Earlier in this episode, we talked about red and green PMGs, and I want to get into that in a second. But I want to ask you, kind of go to the positive information here, the positive tone, and ask you about your 98 PMG set chase. Um, Tell me a little bit more about that. When did you start, and are you looking to do it in all sports? And like, how far along are you? Tell us about your progress there.
Yeah, so I don't think I'm going to have many progress updates anytime soon. I don't know if you saw the Mike Piazza that just sold for $12,000. I was
Yeah, yeah,
really hoping to get that one, and
yep.
I was blown out of the water. So as far as I've always been, and I think this is kind of unusual in the modern hobby. Most people nowadays are player collectors or team collectors. But back in the day, like if you talk to vintage collectors, the way you collected back then was by collecting sets. And that's how my father collected. And for whatever reason, that was passed along to me. I don't know. I've always been kind of a completionist too. I've always, if I'm into something or whatever, I want everything. Or if I'm playing a game, I want to do everything in the game. Whatever it is, I've just kind of had that completionist mindset. So that's how I've always approached 90s cards as well. And I completed a few sets, before the 98 PMGs. And they were mostly small insert sets like the Millennium Men set. Um, I almost completed the Essential Credentials baseball set. I was like 2 cards away. Apparitions, refractors, things like that. And what I learned by doing that was that for a lot of these sets, you end up feeling like you're buying the same card over and over again. Like if you look at the Millennium Men set, yeah, okay, it's got a different person on it. But other than that, the entire card's the same. And I realized after completing some of these sets that I wasn't attached to the set. I was usually just attached to like one card in the set, the Griffey, the Kobe, the Jordan, whatever it was. And I could take or leave the rest. And I think what makes the 98 PMG baseball set, and same applies to the 98 PMG football set and the 97 PMG championship basketball set. It's different names for each one, but I think what makes that set unique is that every card in the set doesn't just have a different picture of a different player on it. It has a completely different background. It's a totally different card. And in some ways, when I'm collecting that set, I feel like I'm not collecting players as much as I'm collecting backgrounds. And it's really satisfying. It's much more satisfying to look through your set and, when every card feels unique and feels special in some way, rather than just like a piece, because you feel like you have to complete the set and you just need this card and it looks like all the other cards and it's of some scrub player. I can get satisfaction out of pretty much any card in that set.
Yeah, I think that's especially true, especially when you're looking at 96 and 97 metal. And it's like, well, these are creative designs and there's that kind of comic book aesthetic to them. But it can be a little bit redundant, especially since some of them have the exact same background. But then when
Exactly.
you get with the 98s and the 97 championship, you can look for landmarks and try to figure out what it is behind the player, and if you're not
I
from
was
that area, do the research.
I was so excited. I found before I lived in my current place, I lived on Venice Beach, and I got the Shack PMG, and I could literally see my condo in the background of that, and I could identify what street it was, and like I could
Wow.
see, oh my god, that's my building, like it's in the background of this card. It's so cool. And by the way, I originally started collecting the basketball set, and when that became prohibitively expensive, it made the baseball and football sets look like an absolute bargain. Like I think the Ken Griffey Jr. card, when I bought it, was going for like $700 at the same time that the Kobe PMG was going for over 10,000. And so it just made like, you know, again, at that time I had less disposable income. And so, I'm like, if I'm going to complete this set, I'm going to need to like refocus. And so I switched to baseball. And of course, as it happens, other people had that same idea. And eventually now we're at the point where there's very little difference between baseball and basketball, really, in terms of price. But what I like about the baseball championship set and even the football championship set too, that distinguishes it from the basketball set, is that the backgrounds are a lot more playful and a lot more tongue in cheek and have more layers of meaning to them. In the basketball set, most of the backgrounds just correspond to a player's home city, their team city. Some of them don't. Like Kevin Garnett is just like a crane. And I know that's not in Minnesota because in the baseball set they use that same background for a player who I think is on the Toronto Blue Jays. So it's
Yeah.
like crane can't be in Toronto and Minnesota at the same time. But what's cool about the baseball set is that like the backgrounds are more than just backgrounds associated with their team city. So like you have some backgrounds that are references to pop culture, like Chipper Jones's background is a
Field
cornfield,
of
and it's a
Dreams.
reference
Yeah.
of the Field of Dreams. And or like one of my favorites is there's a player named Matt Stairs, and so they have him running up this giant flight of stairs, and it's like okay, it's punny,
Yeah.
it's like very or like you'll have there are a lot of animal backgrounds. I don't think basketball has any animal backgrounds, but like a lot of the Cubs players will have bears in the backgrounds, or Barry
Hmm.
Sanders has the lion. Tony Clark has a tiger, which I always love. Tony the
Yeah.
tiger. It's like fun little Easter eggs like that, and the backgrounds make you think a little more, and it just adds to that like that satisfaction you get out of every card. If I can
Marshall
enjoy
Falk
a
with the Colts.
card, what's that?
Marshall Falk with the Colts in the background is one of my favorites
Exactly,
too.
so cool.
Stable.
And it's like, but again, it's that added layer of meaning, and that's what I love about it. If I had to buy, a Matt Stairs essential credentials to complete my credential set, I'm going to toss it aside, and it just becomes a filler piece. Whereas in the PMG set, it's one of my favorite cards in the set.
Yeah. That's a great breakdown of that set. Let's move into the reds and greens a little bit because that's kind of the focus of the episode. And um, over the last, I mean, I know it's been going on for a long, long time, but over the last couple of years, I feel like there's been like this proliferation of fake green football PMGs. They've just flooded the market that we've seen it on various auction platforms, on eBay, Fanatics Collect, etc. So you and I have talked about this a bit, right? There's a pack pulled serial that's very distinct. That is the serial number that PSA will grade, and then there is what we would call a non-conforming or a divergent serial that is an aftermarket stamp. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the evolution of, well, first of all, the stamping, generally speaking, in the 90s and of 90s cards, and then how that eventually led to sheets being cut up pre and post bankruptcy sale.
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to give a little background on stamping and replacement copies specifically. So my attitude, first of all, as an authenticator, is that every card is real until I prove it's not. Just because the PMGs come in two different style stamps does not mean inherently that one of them must be fake. And I think that's a common fallacy that a lot of like novice authenticators fall into. For instance, a few years ago, I remember a big '90s collector, one of the most legendary '90s collectors, great collector, super knowledgeable. But he started posting about these credentials that he was saying had fake serial numbers on them, and his rationale for why they were fake was because the slash between numbers was too long. And he showed it to me, and I saw his posts, and I was not comfortable calling them fake just because one had a long slash and one did not. Now, the long slash was much less common. I knew the short slash ones were all real. The long slash ones were the ones that were up for debate. I was of the opinion that it was still possible that they were replacement copies. So I was never comfortable I was not willing to risk my credibility by calling them fake. And it wasn't until about 2 years after that someone contacted me, and they wanted to show me this David Robinson card they had. I think they were selling it. I can't remember. But they were like, oh, it's actually really cool. I still have the letter from Fleer from when I sent this in as a replacement. And sure enough, his copy had the long slash. And he was able to produce a letter from Fleer confirming that he had sent in this David Robinson card and they had sent this card back to him as a replacement. And my favorite part about that letter was they actually cut out the serial number and taped it to the letter, the original card that he sent in. So we could see that the original card he sent in had the short slash and the one he received back had a long slash. And it was the
Wow.
same serial number. So that was concrete evidence that the long slash versions were actually replacement copies. I'll give you another example. of a card that surfaced that everyone was saying, was fake. It was a Tim Duncan 1997 Skybox Star Rubies, numbered 008 out of 50. And not only did that card surface, but the original 008 out of 50 surfaced. Now, the one on the questionable copy, the 008, was tiny. It was much smaller than the authentic copy. It wasn't even close. And so I remember going on Blowout someday, and there was some thread being like, "Hey, watch out, everyone! This Tim Duncan's fake, and not only is this one fake, but here's the real 008 out of 50." Now that was another time where I was like, people came to me and they were like, "Look at this fake card," and I was like, "I'm not comfortable calling this fake." And my whole thing as an authenticator is if I can create a narrative or a story that explains how this card came into existence, then it could be real. If I can't do that, that's the only time I'm comfortable saying it's fake. So, like with the long slash versions, I could think of a story where, yeah, like you send in your cards and they use a different stamp and send it back. That's plausible. So I wasn't comfortable doing that. And in this case, too, I could think of an instance. And in fact, in this case, it was actually much easier to build a narrative because the 97 Skybox set is kind of quirky when it comes to its stamps. There's a stamp that was used for the base set. And then there was a stamp that was a totally different stamp that was only used for the Team Skybox subset. And it's a much smaller stamp. And the stamp on this Duncan, which was the base version, looked to me a lot like the stamp that was on the Team Skybox version. And in fact, I ended up getting a card in hand. I was able to analyze them side by side, and they were identical. And also, in fact, that 008, the real one, the one people were saying, "Oh, this is the authentic serial number," had extensive damage on the card. It was graded authentic. It had really bad damage on the bottom border. So it was very easy for me to construct a narrative. Okay, the real card has damage. Well, if I'd pulled that card in the 90s, I would have sent it in as a replacement. Okay, now let me put myself in Fleur's shoes. I get this card back. I know I need to, get a blank copy and put a new stamp on it that matches the serial number. I go to the serial numbering machine that was used that we used for the Star Rubies. The last cards that would have been stamped for the Star Ruby set would have been those Team Skybox Star Rubies because they were at the very end of the set. They would have ostensibly they were the last cards stamped before the cards were inserted into packs. So if they went to the machine that was used to stamp the Star Ruby, or they wanted to pick up the last stamp that was used, it would have been the stamp from Team Skybox. So all that happened was that they just used the Team Skybox stamp on the replacement instead of the correct base stamp, which is an easy mistake to make. And sure enough, other cards since then have surfaced, other base cards have surfaced with the Team Skybox, with that smaller Team Skybox stamp. And sure enough, every time one surfaces, it's of a player that you would have had a motivation to replace back in the 90s. It was Keith Van Horn, Kobe Bryant, and Tim Duncan are the only ones I've seen with the smaller numbers. And that fits the story that I'm building in my head, this narrative of how these cards came to existence. Is like, yeah, Keith Van Horn, nowadays you wouldn't bother, but back in the late 90s, Keith Van Horn was up there with Tim Duncan as far as the rookie class went, and you would have absolutely wanted to replace that. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here.
No, it's great to hear. Good information.
Yeah,
so yeah, I'll redirect you back. Well, your story made me think of 98 Ultra Football Series 1 and Series 2. The number is bigger on one and smaller on the other. They don't look anything alike. The of 98 is the same, but it's different. So I could see how that.
And it's the same with Star Rubies from 98. The short one series has the big numbers, and then the other series has the smaller numbers.
Exactly. So for take us to the reds and the greens, and kind of how you kind of just gave us some good examples of where you default to it's real unless I have reason to believe it's fake. What has led you down to these reds and greens, and mainly football, and talk about basketball too, where you feel pretty confident that there's a lot of these with the quote unquote divergent serial would probably be considered fake.
Yeah. And just a quick pedantic point, but it's not like even reason to believe it's fake. I have to be rock solid. I have a lot of reasons to believe certain things are fake, but I don't call them out or I don't reject them because I need to feel 100% certain. Now, how do I get that certainty with the PMG reds and greens? Well, there's, a lot of reasons. First of all, The stamps themselves are very crude and unsophisticated. They are unlike anything any card manufacturer, has ever used before or since. They're very low quality. They're very inconsistent. The foil is all over the place. A lot of them are over and under stamped. They're stamped too deeply into the cards. There's like, so a lot of them you can see from the front. So already, that is suspicious. Now, it doesn't mean they're fake. But then you start looking at some of the other pieces of evidence. For instance, this style of stamp, is not unique to the Precious Metal Gems football set. It's used. It's seen on other Fleer sets that also have two different styles of stamp. So, and it's not just Fleer too. It's also Tops and Upper Deck products. It's products created by other manufacturers have this exact same weird style stamp on them. The bigger problem is that the only sets that you find this stamp on are sets that have been confirmed to be backdoored. These stamps, you will not find them on any set that does not have blank copies floating around. So for every one of these sets that has this stamp, there are unstamped ones floating around too. So already that's a big issue for anyone who claims that these are real stamps. Well, why are they being used by multiple manufacturers? And why are these manufacturers only putting them on sets that end up backdoored? It doesn't make sense. They're also extremely ubiquitous. Like, if these were replacement stamps, you would expect maybe one or two to surface for every 100 copies of authentic stamps that surface. And you would expect to find them only on players that would have been worth sending in as replacements back in the 90s, like with these other sets. All the replacement cards from Credentials and all the replacement cards from Star Rubies are all these big players that were actually worth money back then. And we've also seen, real replacement copies like these other sets, and they all use the original stamps or other stamps that Fleer used on other products. So not only is it basically impossible to build a narrative where these stamps are real, but you also, if you examine them, all the ones, all the cards with fake stamps are sheet cut. They don't exhibit the same factory cuts that the other style of serial numbers do. The patterns on them are different. I won't go too in depth on how we detect trimming, but they're cut completely differently than the other copies. So now you have another thing. It's Occam's razor basically. It's how many assumptions do I have to make before I can conclude these cards are real? And so now you also have to assume that for these cards they cut them in a completely different way than they cut all the other serial numbers. It doesn't really, it's strange credulity at that point. So when you add all these things up, the fact that, you find them on products from multiple different companies, they're only on products that have blank copies floating around. They look really crude and unlike anything that they would ever use for replacements, and how ubiquitous they are. Like, I'd say roughly 50% of the Fleer Metal Universe PMG football auctions that come up are using the fake stamp, which to me indicates that they're sheet cut. And the blank sheets for PMG red and green are very, very common. Someone actually texted me the other day. They were at a flea market, and someone was selling a stack of 15 PMG green football sheets. So that explains why there's hundreds of these replacement copies floating around. If you also look at the sales patterns, I've been buying these cards for a long time, and I see all the listings that come up. You'll find these cards all listed together. You'll find a lot of 100 PMGs, and they all have the bad stamp on them that no one has ever seen come out of a pack. That's the other thing too, by the way. A lot of these cards are being opened today. They were opened back then. No one has ever been able to produce a card that they pulled themselves that has this serial number on it. People breaking the cards today have never pulled out a card with this kind of serial number on it. Which by now, if half of the serial numbers were designed that way, you would expect half the cards you pull to have that serial number on it. And the fact that you're seeing lots, I was telling Zan before the show started, but I once bought a lot of Z-Force raves of like 70 of them for 50 cents a piece, and they were all had the bad stamps on them. And not only that, but when you do see the lots, the cards in the lot are sheetmates. So like the Z Force lot I bought, where they were all bad stamps, I went and looked at the sheets, at the uncut sheets, and sure enough, all the cards that I bought in that lot came off of the same sheet. So again, there's really no room or no universe where these cards could possibly be legitimate.
And another add-on there is with some greens. There was a bulk of greens. Maybe it was, I don't know if it was last summer or the summer before, graded by a different company, where the certs were almost all sequential. So they were
Exactly.
all subbed at the same time. And so, what are the odds of a bunch of real green PMGs being subbed all together in one lot, and they all bore the
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
same
they
fake
have the
stamp?
same serial number, and they all have the bad serial numbers. What a coincidence, right?
Yeah,
Going back to the factory cuts, you were showing me that Terrell Owens card,
yeah. I
and
want
the
to talk
first
about
thing,
that. Yeah,
even though I couldn't see the serial number in it based on the photos you were showing me, I could see that left edge does not look natural. It's got a very strange whitening pattern on it that you don't see on any pack pulled copies of that card. There are other indicators. I guarantee if I were to examine that card in person, I'd find a million signs that it was trimmed and not factory cut. But you don't even need to necessarily be an expert in order to look at the card and see that there's something unusual about the way it's cut.
right. So let me give the listeners some background. So there's a green Terrell Owens PMG numbered 006 out of 150. It is an old SGC slab. I guess it'd be a 8.5. It's a graded a 92. The card was graded back in 1999, and so I've always had the concern of well, it's such an old, it's in an old slab. It was graded in 1999. Was this an issue back then? And from what you tell me, it was.
Yeah, so I hear this all the time too. Well, it was back then; it wasn't worth doing, or people, didn't have that. A lot of people think that cards weren't backdoored until the Fleer bankruptcy auction in 2005. That's a total fallacy. I mean, the late 90s was the golden age of backdooring. Nowadays, post bankruptcy, companies are actually pretty good about keeping a lid on their products and not leaking products out into the public. There's very few backdoored Panini cards, for instance. That being said, Topps never had a bankruptcy auction, and yet hundreds of sheets, uncut sheets, were backdoored from Topps and had fake stamps applied to them. And in some cases, the same exact style of stamp that we see on the football cards. As far as value goes, like I've seen, first of all, we were just talking about, counterfeiters today are counterfeiting cards that are creating really sophisticated counterfeits of cards that are only worth $3 to $5 that take way more effort to reproduce than it does to reproduce just a simple foil stamp. And if you do go back in time and you look at the values of these cards, Brian actually, before we got on, he looked up the value of the Barry Sanders PMG Green. It was $1,000. So if you worked at a factory and you had this PMG Green sheet, one card on that sheet would make it worthwhile to cut up the entire sheet. The entire sheet was probably worth close to $5,000 to $10,000 once you cut it up and applied fake stamps. So there was no shortage of incentive back then to cut up these products. And also, if there's one thing I've learned, is that counterfeiters don't need much financial incentive in order to create counterfeits. Even if they're only clearing a couple bucks per card, it's worthwhile to them.
So we talked about the volume. You mentioned it before, the volume of PMGs that pop up. About like 50% or half of them seem to be that aftermarket stamp or that non-pack pulled card. Are there any other specific sets out of the 90s that people should start being concerned about, in your opinion?
Yeah, there's a handful of them, but it's kind of random. Like for instance, with PMG Reds and Greens, the basketball set is fine. I've never seen I've seen one blank back. I was at a grading event we did in China recently, and someone submitted a PMG red Tim Duncan that was missing in the stamp. That was the first PMG basketball card I've ever seen that didn't have a stamp on. PMG basketball generally very safe, and you also have to split it into two different categories. There's backdoored cards, which are cards that were printed by the manufacturer but were never meant to be released to the public and usually not serial numbered. And then there's outright counterfeits. And the thing about counterfeits is that it's changing all the time. One set that was historically safe for 15 years suddenly becomes unsafe overnight. It's a bit more stable when we're talking about backdoored stuff. Most of the stuff that's been backdoored has surfaced at this point. We're aware of it. Not all of it, I'm sure. But yeah, so sets like pretty much anything from the '90s, you should be skeptical of. There's nothing. There are sets that are considered relatively safe that I've never seen a fake of or never seen a backdoored copy of, and then there's sets where roughly half the cards that surface are backdoored, like the PMG football cards or like Skybox '97 Skybox Z Force. Or where most of the cards are fake. I'd say the most dangerous set is 1998 to 99 Thunder Rave. There are, we could spend a whole episode just talking about that set and how weird it is. The cards are numbered to 150, but there's actually only a handful of copies of each player that have ever surfaced. No one knows why. I don't know why. But I've only ever seen there are, I think, 5 or 6 confirmed Jordans that have ever surfaced in the last 20 years, and only a handful of Kobe's. And yet, if you go on eBay, there's listings ending for Kobe and Jordan Thunder Raves pretty much every week. So any Thunder Rave, Kobe, Jordan, or Pippen cards, very dangerous. Trying to think of other like really deadly sets. A lot of the masterpiece sets you have to be careful with because there's unstamped copies with fake stamps. Actually, you know what the scariest one is? The best counterfeit to this date is the starting 5. And those are tricky because, like Desert Shield, which has a similar issue, it's just a base card with a stamp applied to it. So that's like catnip for counterfeiters. They don't even need to find the backdoored product. All they need is a base card, and they just apply a stamp to it. So there's very low barrier of entry. The Jordan's only a couple bucks. You're not taking a big risk. And the only thing you need to develop is the fake stamp. Now, the fake stamp that has been developed for it is very sophisticated. It's probably the best fake stamp I've ever seen in my life. And it only surfaced within the last year or so. And I know the guy who's making them, and he's making some very sophisticated, very scary counterfeits. But the good news is we know who he is. We know what sets he's targeting. We actually know which uncut sheets he's purchased. We really have a good handle on it at this point.
I have 2 specific questions I want to ask you about 2 situations. One situation and then one anomaly. The first one is recently, maybe a month ago, within the past couple of months, 2 1999 PMGs of Barry Bonds surface, both graded by PSA. I think one was an 8, one was a 7. Both were serial numbered 01 out of 50, and I believe that the ultimate conclusion was they were both real. What is your best guess or your best explanation for how that happened?
Well, first of all, you can't prove something is real. There's always a chance that a time traveling magician, stepped out of a time machine and created it out of thin air. It's the same thing. You can't. It's like proving a negative. You can't really prove it. All you can do is try and prove it's fake. And so, in the absence of any proof that something is fake, my attitude, and I think the correct attitude, is that every card is innocent. My worst nightmare would be to condemn a card as fake that's actually authentic. I love these cards. I'm very attached to them, and I would hate to see a card get destroyed or tossed aside. That happened to me when I was a kid. Actually, quick tangent. One of the first cards I ever bought was a 1948 Leaf Babe Ruth card, and this was back when eBay was the Wild West, and you had to send a check through the mail. Yeah. I remember the listing. The listing was so sketchy. It was like, I bought these in an estate sale. I don't know if they're real. They could be fake. They were also selling the Jackie Robinson. Wow. Remember, I bought the Babe Ruth for like $50. This would have been like 2004 or something. I remember the Jackie Robinson went for like $60, and I couldn't afford it. And I was so excited. I own a real Babe Ruth card from when he was alive, and I took it into my sports card shop. I won't say which one because it's still around, and I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus. But the owner of the shop, when I showed it to him, and I told him, "Oh yeah, it was from an estate sale on eBay," and da da da, He's like, this is not real. Like, this is a fake card. You have to be careful. You can't just go buying cards. And I was so bummed. I threw that card in a drawer raw and forgot about it for literally 15 years. And I rediscovered it when I was like moving or something. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to submit it. It cost, back then it was like $7. I was like, just go ahead. And sure enough, it was real. So I think that it instilled in me, from a young age, that I do not want to do that to anyone else. Tell them that their card is fake and have it turn out to be real. And so when it comes to this Barry Bonds, I've examined them both. I cannot find any difference between the stamps. They're both, as far as I can tell, completely legitimate. And so in the absence of any evidence that one would be fake, I can't come out and say it's fake. Most likely it was a replacement situation.
Okay, gotcha. And the other question I wanted to,
It could also be an error. I mean, to
right?
this day, there are people pulling duplicate serial numbers out of the same pack. Quality control was pretty good in the 90s, but it was not perfect. There were a lot of shenanigans, a lot of errors that happened with hand numbering and serial numbers. So it's also possible that both cards came out of a pack with the same
Okay.
serial number.
Okay. Before we get into your top five cards in your PC, the other question I wanted to ask was we were talking about sets that are relatively safe a second ago. 98 PMGs for football, relatively safe, but the gym masters
Yeah,
watch out for
the same
counterfeits
guy,
or
yeah, the same
backdoor, I guess.
guy who made the starting five stamp purchased some uncut sheets of Gem Masters and cut them up and stamped them. And again, this guy's really sophisticated. So the stamps are very hard to distinguish. But yeah, the regular PMGs totally safe. Same for basketball Gem Masters, 98, 99 basketball PMGs. As far as I know, totally safe. The only thing I've ever seen were two Rodmans that had, I think, were proof cards. One was numbered 99 or 91 out of 50,
Mm.
which is obviously impossible. It's just, jersey numbered. Um, and I believe that was created as like a proof or as an executive proof. Back then, they used to have what they call like executive proofs or executive copies, and what that just meant was like they would print an extra copy and give it to some of the executives at the company, and a lot of those cards ended up back on the market as well.
I'm gonna ask one more question too about one of ones, like in general. So, we'll focus on the nines. Okay, so one of ones, there's really no one of one. Like they're printing at the company multiple one of ones for like backup copies and like you said, executive copies. And do they send, a copy to the league or something for like review and things like that? Are there multiples of one of ones made in the company?
There are, but they're not usually stamped.
Okay.
So, like I was on eBay, I found two sheets from 99 Masterpiece Football. I'd never seen a blank or a fake or anything. That being said, there were some sets. So yeah, in the case of one of ones that weren't stamped by the company and later backdoored and had fake stamps applied to those, I don't really consider those true one of ones. So I do think for some sets, yes, there are absolutely one of ones. Even if there are backdoored versions, those are just not legitimate. That being said, there are some sets where Fleer actually pre-stamped the one of ones. Usually, they would wait until the replacement came in, and they would stamp the card with the same stamp, the same serial number as the original copy, so that it was a true replacement. With one of ones, you don't need to worry about that. If the one of one's coming in, you know what the serial number is going to be. So for sets like 98 Ultra Baseball, for sets like 99 Ultra Baseball, and 99 Ultra Basketball, there are multiple copies of a lot of these one of ones floating around, and there's technically no way to distinguish them. That being said, if you're talking about 99 baseball, I remember when the duplicates hit the market. I was buying at the time, and there was a seller who literally had the complete masterpiece set that he was selling, and all the stamps were original. The only thing that distinguished them from other masterpieces were the fact that they were all in very poor condition. So obviously Fleer had printed these as replacements. And when the set kind of expired and they weren't worried about replacements anymore, they were probably just shoved into a drawer or put into a box. And they were not well taken care of until they resurfaced and were, graded by PSA. So that's the only indicator I can use, is that if I have two 99 Ultra Baseball or Ultra Baseball masterpieces, I can presume that the one in better condition is probably the one that came out of the pack, and the one in worse condition is probably a replacement copy. but that's not foolproof. I can't say that definitively. That's just kind of a heuristic I use for that set. But
Well, this has been a fantastic interview. I want to wrap this up on a collector note since, at your heart, you are a collector. So
of course.
take us through your top 5 cards in your PC. Just give us maybe a brief overview of kind of, maybe how you came to acquire it or why you love it, kind of going from 5 down to number 1, your favorite card.
Yeah, I probably should have prepared this beforehand. I know you sent this question
It's
earlier.
okay.
Didn't do my homework, but I'm going to go off the top of my head. I'm going to start. I don't know if this is the exact order, but I'll start with one of my favorites. It's from my dad's 52 mantle. If the house were on fire, that might be the first one I'd grab. Not that I keep it at my house, but in this metaphor, pretend it's at my house.
Yeah.
It's very sentimental to me. It was like when I was a little kid, it was like the card. It was my dad's best card. So
Yeah.
now it'll always be one of my best cards because of that.
You're saying if the vault is burning down, that's what you'll say, right?
If the bank burns down, I'll
If
be
the bank burns down.
bank to salvage it from the ashes.
That's right.
Um, I think another one of my favorite cards is the Skybox Art to Bart, the Matt Groening sketch card. I think it's actually the first sketch card ever produced. Someone might correct me if I'm wrong. But I grew up a huge Simpsons fan, and I actually just bought the Redemption to go with it. And I love, it's an original drawing by Matt Groening on a card. It's like all the things I love in one object. And then I think for top 3, it's going to be pretty predictable, not that interesting. 3 would probably be the Ken Griffey Jr. PMG Championship. A lot of these cards, like when you really work hard to acquire a card yourself, you're definitely more attached to it than a card that just comes up on eBay that you bought. I chased down this Griffey and I drove out to Vegas to buy it. Bought it for like 10 grand. It was in an 8 point. I think my favorite part about it was in an 8.5 BGS case, and BGS had misjudged the centering. So all the PMGs from that year were offset to one side or the other. They were justified. And whoever graded it thought that the card was off-centered, when in fact it was correctly centered. So I cracked it out, submitted it to PSA, got a 9, which I think is still Pop 1. And so very, very best crossover I've ever had. Number 2 would be the Kobe PMG Red. I told this story before on Instagram, but I bought that. It was about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now. I can't remember. I think 2 years ago. I was browsing eBay one night, and Kobe PMG came up as a buy it now for $250, and I knew it was real. I could look at the images. I knew it was a real card. I thought maybe the images might be stolen, but the seller was a thrift shop in North Carolina, and had really good feedback. So I hit the buy it now. And I'd learned from doing this a long time that the order would probably be canceled very quickly. And it was. And I was like, okay, any minute now, this is going to be relisted. Sure enough, it was. I think it was relisted for about $12,000. So in between me buying it and him relisting it, in the span of about 10 minutes, the seller realized what they had, relisted it. I bought it again. I sent the seller a message being like, how many times am I going to have to buy this card before you just send it to me? And he was like, no, you're fine. Like, you're good. And sent it out, got it. Ended up sending him some more money afterwards to thank him. But the story behind that card was the person who brought it into the thrift store had found it in a roadside flea market in a dollar bin and paid $1 for it. So I just love that story. It went from some guy buying it for $1 at the flea market, ending up at the thrift store, and found its way into my collection. So I love provenance too as an authenticator.
Yeah.
So know kind of how the card wound up with you is always nice. And then my top one would be my Jordan PMG Championship. That to me was always a grail card. I watched the price go up. I was making more money, but that card was like outpacing my salary.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where I could tell the window for me being able to buy that card was closing. And I made a mad dash. It was like, I think the fall of 2020, mad dash just to find a copy of that card. Overpaid for it at the time, paid like, it's like 55,000 in cash. I had to drive out to Vegas with like a duffel bag, full of money. To meet some guy's dad at a casino, not even the guy from like middleman. It was just very, it was fun in a way. Stressful at the time, but looking back on it, it's a good story and it's just fun. And of course, it's a Jordan PMG champ.
Wow. I think that's probably our best top five we've had. But funny enough, that's the second guest in a row whose top five has included the 93 Art to Bart. So that's,
Really, who
yes, our guest last week, he
the
had
other
that.
person is? My kindred spirit.
Yeah, his number one was a Chris Farley card. So, which was
Pop
cool.
culture. Who was
Yeah.
this?
JRF Illini on Instagram. So he's got a really cool, diverse collection. Your story about the Kobe Red made me think about that. I don't remember that thread on Blowout where the guy found the Favre 99 Gym Masters in a dollar box and
Yeah.
posted it on
Oh,
Blowout.
yeah. Or they got my favorite from the Blowout days is the guy who bought an opened box of '98 Flair Showcase and it had the Dirk Nowitzki Road 2 masterpiece in it. Like literally, someone had opened the box, put all the cards back in the box, and some guy just sold it as is. And imagine that, like finding a box that's already been opened, you assume it's been picked through, and then you pull out a Nowitzki masterpiece rookie. Like,
Doesn't get much better.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure everybody really will enjoy this episode and learn a lot. And maybe we can have you on in the future. Thanks, Brendan.
Appreciate it. Have a good one.
Jeez, what an interview, man. I tell you, we've said before, we don't hold ourselves out as experts or anything. We're just kind of fanatics about 90 cards. And we try to do our research before we get into sets and everything. But just listening to Brendan talk makes you feel like you don't know shit, right?
It does, yeah. I mean, if you listen to this episode and you would sometimes send cards to maybe SGC or BGS or any other company, when you hear him talk and know that he's on PSA side and that Nat reached out to him to get him on the team in terms of authenticating these things, like, why would you ever submit a card to another company or even think about it? And then it also brings up like, it reaffirms what we've always thought about, I'll just say it like BGS, how far behind they are in authentication. Because as a collector, you think of three things. For me, the primary goal is to have my card authenticated. That's number one. Then number two, I'm looking at the grading process, like how accurate are they in my terms or in collector terms of grading a card for quality. And then number three would be the slab quality. But like, it seems like other companies tend to put other things ahead of the authentication process. They overlook it. And as you can hear from Brendan talk, there's so many intricacies that you and I or anybody really could never know unless they have just this wealth of actual life knowledge like he has. And luckily for Nat and PSA, like he's on their team. And it really just is amazing to me. It reaffirms the fact that PSA, for me, PSA is the best grain company. I will forever submit cards to them. And I mean, this makes me want to even submit more cards to them. I'm not like doing a commercial for them necessarily, but I'm like, it energizes me, honestly, listening to him talk about the authentication process.
Yeah, it definitely makes me feel more confident. And I'm kind of a PSA loyalist in general, but I certainly will continue doing it. And now, I mean, hearing his, cautionary tales about some of these sets, I'm willing to pay up for cards in PSA slabs because if they're newer cert numbers, I know that their current system has been involved in reviewing it. If it's an older cert number, I have the comfort of the buyback guarantee or the authenticity guarantee or whatever you want to call it. So it definitely encourages me to, generally speaking, on some of these maybe more risky sets, choose the graded copy. So that was an incredible episode. It's going to be hard to top that with our PMG series. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking about the 98s and the 99s and having additional guests on. But hope you guys enjoyed that. Feel free to DM us your thoughts. Shoot us a like on YouTube. Follow us on Instagram, and we'll catch you next week.